Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. So we're back for a China update with our very own Mike Dahm, known around these parts as JDAM. So it doesn't take an expert to understand the Pacific superpower is a really big deal. But it does take expertise to understand the nuances of the how and the why of China's power and assess what we should do about it. As you know, Mike is an expert second to none in this regard. He's a retired U.S. Navy intelligence officer with over 25 years of experience, focused on China and the Asia-Pacific region. Mike served extensively throughout the region, including a tour as an assistant U.S. naval attaché in Beijing. He also served as the senior naval intelligence officer for China at the Office of Naval Intelligence. And in his civilian career, Mike has continued his China research at multiple FFRDCs and now Mitchell. JDAM, welcome. You're one of our most popular guests, so no pressure.
No pressure at all. I'm happy to be here. I really just wanted to come back and check on you and see how you were doing. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, life is good.
You know why I ask, right?
Why?
Well, because when we closed out our last episode, we were talking about how it's now the Chinese year of the snake.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And you were born in the year of the tiger.
And they don't get along well.
And no, the tigers don't get along with the snake's bestie, the monkey. So you haven't, there have been no monkey.
There's a lot going on here.
But no monkey-related incidents.
No monkey-related incidents, thank goodness.
Okay, so you're still doing well.
Still doing well.
Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, although our mechanic working on not our Stearman, somebody else's Stearman, had to deal with a snakes on a plane scenario.
Ooh.
There were a couple snakes that had decided to make a winter home in the accessory section of the Stearman.
See, gotta beware.
Gotta
You're
beware.
The snake, the house of Slytherin.
There you go. All right. So, one of the most buzzworthy topics when it comes to Chinese military power are their so-called sixth-generation combat aircraft that we saw in the press the day after Christmas, right? So, what's going on these days?
Yeah, so there are just a few updates. So again, we had these two purported sixth-generation fighters. On the internet, they're called the J-36 and the J-50. We talked about them on the last podcast. That was just after Christmas. And so we've seen them conducting a few more test flights in and around their respective factories in both March and April. So we've got more pictures, and that gives us a few more details of the aircraft, about the aircraft. We still don't know very much. So first, there's the J-36. That's manufactured, or at least its prototype has been manufactured in a place called Chengdu, which is in central China. That's where China makes their J-10C and their fifth-gen J-20 aircraft. The J-36 features a diamond-shaped tailless design, and one of the things that we've seen from some of these new images seems to confirm that it does in fact have a tandem side-by-side cockpit arrangement.
Okay.
So something more like the F-111, which may indicate that it has more of a mission as like a fighter bomber or a small form bomber. One of the things that I stumbled across when I was researching this diamond-shaped tailless design, have you ever heard of the Hopeless Diamond?
Yes, I have.
It was Lockheed's Have Blue aircraft. That was the nickname, was the Hopeless Diamond. So the Hopeless Diamond, there were two prototypes developed in the late 1970s, and that led to the development ultimately of the F-117 stealth fighter. So I guess the point is that a lot has been made about, look at this, it's a diamond-shaped tailless aircraft. Well, we've had tailless aircraft since the end of the Second World War, and this diamond shape was something that we were working on at Skunk Works 50 years ago. So what can we really say other than that's what it is? It's a diamond-shaped tailless design. It appears to have 3 engines, which is a little bit interesting. Some of the reporting suggests...
what do you think the 3 engines are for?
More power. It just comes down to power. Power for onboard systems, but also probably power to move the thing along. There is some speculation on the internet, and again, this is all just people measuring things out and drawing conclusions from that. But the internet... sources on the internet are saying this thing could weigh as much as 100,000 pounds, which is about 20 pounds north of what an F-15 Strike Eagle weighs. I think that's in the neighborhood of 80,000 pounds, right? So this is a big, heavy aircraft.
They need the thrust.
They need more thrust or much bigger engines, and if you want to keep it slim, to preserve stealth low observable capabilities, you'd want to have more power in three engines.
And the center engine is above and aft of the cockpit.
It appears that all of the intakes are above the cockpit, as I recall, and behind the cockpit. So kind of like the B-2 in that regard in terms of where the intakes are. There's less information and more speculation about what they're calling the J-50, which apparently now also has the moniker JXDS.
From who? Is that JXDS? Is that China?
Yeah, so that's JXDS is, again, it's one of these things that's showing up on the internet. I wasn't able to find an origin for it, but the J-50 has been seen flying around Shenyang, which is up in northeast China, and this is where China makes its J-15 and J-16 aircraft. Those are the Su-27 knockoffs. So again, it's a tailless lambda-shaped wing design. One of the interesting things that came out from some of these new images, which are higher resolution, is that the J-50 appears to have articulated wingtips. So the outer sections of the wings are like movable control surfaces that would add to maybe super maneuverability and control in the absence of the vertical stabilizers.
That's interesting. So let's go back. The J-36, I just looked it up. Actually, the center engine is the only one that's above the wing line.
Oh, I stand corrected.
The two are underneath it are really shaped more like F-22 inlets. So they've got the diamond structure, but they're hidden underneath the strake.
Okay.
Where it cranks then out towards the rest of the wing. Part of the reason why I think that might be is just more space for where they need to create airflow with that center line. That way they don't interfere with any weapons loading.
Yeah, you can put
you've got the internal weapons bay on the center line, comes out underneath there, and also then decreases any kind of RCS signature from the bottom.
Right.
So putting that up top. So when you look at it, it's kind of like, that harkens back a little bit to the F-107 and having that engine inlet right behind it. But especially like if you have an engine out situation, having that center line thrust, I think, would be really important since they don't have the tail.
Sure.
To provide that kind of longitudinal stability and an engine out. So, JDAM, in your mind, what you've read and observed, what differentiates these aircraft from past Chinese advanced types like the J-20? So we've talked a lot about this. Folks are calling them 6th generation. But that actually requires, I think, a lot of internal capabilities. It's not just LO. It's not just maneuverability. You need to have the sensors, the processing power, and the ability to team. So do you think that these really portend those types of advancements? And are these more along the lines of new airframes that might not have the guts inside to warrant the 6th gen label? I mean, have we seen evidence that types like the J-20 are really 5th gen, or do they just look like it given their shaping?
Yeah, I think we're pretty confident that the J-20 can wear the 5th gen label with pride. There have been a lot of assessments, open source assessments about Russian and Chinese 5th gen aircraft. I'm making air quotes. They're probably not as good as the F-22 and the F-35 in terms of their low observable capabilities, in terms of their onboard technology, in terms of their processing power and cooling and things like that. But they are arguably a step beyond what we would call 4th gen or even 4.5 gen in terms of capability. Where they are in that 5th gen spectrum, again, is open to debate. So everybody is looking at these new aircraft, wild speculation, don't know a whole lot about them, but it's like they don't have tails. So like it must be a next generation aircraft. And, from 5, we go to 6. So it must be a 6th gen aircraft. But 6th gen has never been defined, at least not by our Department of Defense. There's some marketing information out there from different manufacturers about what constitutes 6th gen, and I'm not going to try to argue with any of that. But we don't know how these Chinese aircraft really fit into that category. Are they new designs? Absolutely, 100%. But again, a tailless design is not necessarily a revolutionary design.
But I will tell you something that is important, and I think what the development of the J-36 and the J-50 portend is that they are putting designs out there. And as we know, aircraft that have designs that to meet certain mission requirements, to meet certain performance requirements, to meet certain range and payload requirements, and then you can modernize and upgrade the avionics as necessary. And I think that's the direction that the U.S. Department of Defense is probably going in. I'm guessing that's what they would like to do with F-47, develop a minimum viable product, but then be able to rapidly upgrade the sensors, avionics, and the rest of the communication suite and processing suite as you get the developments and maturity of those capabilities. But if you don't have the airplane, you can't put in, it doesn't matter how great your stuff is, you can't put it in there.
100%. I mean, if you develop a platform and it has a modular design and something that can be, open architecture like we're talking about with the F-35 and follow-on aircraft, the thing that I'd point out is China has the means to develop these things out in the middle of the desert where nobody can see them, to test designs like we would at Skunk Works or, out at White Sands or China Lake.
But they chose to reveal them.
But they have chosen to reveal them and conduct these daytime flights around what are essentially large urban areas where lots of people have their cell phones out. And some of those people were probably told, hey, have your best camera out there because something might happen today, and they can then go post that on the internet, right? There is a higher level information operations campaign going on here where China is being very silent, at least officially, about what these aircraft are and what their capabilities are.
Seeking to create uncertainty within the DoD. What does this mean? What are the intentions?
And generate a lot of buzz and speculation where people are saying, hey, look, like China's actually flying these two aircraft in pretty lazy circles around the sky, but China has aircraft that fly. And the U.S. Department of Defense has designs. Now, you and I don't know what might actually be flying out at White Sands, right? You and I don't actually know what might be in a hangar
at Palmdale or Edwards or any of the other industry sites.
Yeah, that only flies
sites,
at night.
China Lake,
whatever.
Groom Lake, all those good things.
All those good things, right? So maybe you and I are buying too much into the myth of
I will say this, though. I mean, I really have high hopes for Secret Scroll stuff that might be happening in those places. But in the end, you still need to have mass and concentration. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is to have a massive pilot production pipeline. You've got the pilots, the warfighters trained up and actually training in them and taking them out to the range and exercising these aircraft, doing their tactics and so forth. And a lot of that you can't do in this kind of secret environment unless it's a very, very small fleet. And we know that the regional requirements of the Pacific are going to require more than a handful of silver bullets. We're going to need to actually have mass, numbers, quantity to be effective to provide the concentration, the tempo that is going to stress the PLA to the point where we're able to collapse their combat operations. So while I'm grateful and I'm hopeful that there are these secret capabilities that we are unaware of, the reality is it has to then come out in the open if you're going to operationalize that and field it in relevant quantities.
Yeah. How many F-117s did we have?
Like 57.
And how many B-2s did we have? Like we're down to
19
now.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter that you've got the greatest weapon in the world if there are only 24 of them sitting in a bunker at Langley, that you can break glass and deploy in an emergency. But okay, that's 24 weapons versus 1,400 Chinese combat aircraft. So now what do you do?
Do we know how many J-36s and J-50s they've produced?
I think these are prototypes. I think we're talking
Even
about
if they're test articles,
one
a handful?
One and two.
One and two, okay.
I don't know that we have any evidence that there is more than that. I think these are prototypes. I think these are prototypes that are arcing around. There may be some design changes down the road. This might be proof of concept. Just we're not sure at this point.
Well, turning to a different topic, and also there's some uncertainty and some disappearing that's been going on. Another Chinese general has gone missing from public view. And that's been a very powerful signal regarding who's in favor and who might be out of power in the PLA. What's going on here?
Yeah, so this is a continuation of a story that we talked about the last time we did a China update back in January. Several Chinese generals have gone missing, most notably generals that seem to be associated with China's missile program.
Really?
The PLA rocket force that controls China's nuclear arsenal, but also controls all of their medium, intermediate, and short-range ballistic missiles.
And just to be clear, the rocket force, that's what we're concerned about attacking our bases.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, that's the long-range reach out and touch Guam without putting bombers
First
at risk.
island chain, second island chain. Like these are the things that we're all worried about. So if those are the forces that are going to be able to reach out and touch our bases, what does this instability mean for the health of the rocket force and their operationalization, like their actual capability to go do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, they basically put Xi Jinping ended up putting non-rocket force guys in charge of the entire force. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine this would be like, taking the United States Air Force and like putting an army general in charge because the Air Force. Yeah, I know. Yeah. It's like, well, how would that work? But the Chinese tend to be a little more fluid in terms of like, taking off one uniform, putting on another uniform. They're all PLA.
Yeah, they're all, People's Liberation Army, right? So
People's Liberation Army Air Force, People's Liberation Army Navy, so on and so forth.
Rocket forces.
But now we've moved further up the chain with the problems. We saw Miao Hua, who was the kind of the head political commissar on the Central Military Commission. He went away last fall. The Minister of Defense disappeared temporarily, but I believe he is now back, having survived what was probably an investigation into corruption on his part. But now, since March, the second vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, General He Weidong, has been missing from public view. So there are two vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission, a first and a second. And these can basically be considered like the SecDef and the DepSecDef. So He Weidong's like the Deputy Secretary of Defense or a Co-Secretary of Defense within their system.
It's a pretty big deal.
So that's a pretty big deal, right? The first ranked vice chairman is General Zhang Youxia. He still remains in place, and there don't seem to be any problems there. But the significance of General He is that the speculation was that he was very close to Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping served in Fujian province, which is right across the strait from Taiwan, from, I think, 1985 to 2002, right? So he was there for, 17 years. Mm-hmm. And during that time, General He was a commanding general in that region, what used to be the Nanjing military region and then became the Eastern Theater. So it is thought that Xi Jinping developed this personal relationship, or at least professional relationship, with General He during that time in Fujian province. So people were surprised when General He kind of made this meteoric rise to this number 2 position within the Central Military Commission. So we don't know why he is probably under investigation. We don't know why he has disappeared from public view.
Because these generals, they just disappear, and there's no communication about why.
Yeah, and there's no habeas corpus. There's no reading of their rights and public proclamation. This is an internal party matter. Remember, the PLA is a party army.
Yes.
It is not a state army. It does not exist under the state council. It exists under the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party Disciplinary Commission is the one that goes hunting for corruption or people who are out of step.
Air quotes, corruption.
Corruption there's legitimate corruption. I mean, people are taking graft, but it could just be he was out of step with Xi Jinping. He got on the wrong side of a policy. Maybe he stood up and defended somebody he shouldn't have. We really have no idea. I mean, there are all kinds of things that could have brought the gaze of the disciplinary committee of the Chinese Communist Party onto General He. But we don't know. The bottom line is that this is a big deal. It is the first time since the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s that a serving CMC vice chairman has been purged or removed, if in fact he has been purged and he does not reemerge unscathed. But this really underscores, the severity of all of these smaller events and corruption challenges potentially within Chinese military leadership. If our listeners are interested in a commentary on this, there was a good op-ed in the New York Times by Joel Wolfnow and Phil Saunders that talks about whether Xi Jinping can actually trust his generals. And ultimately, this goes down to you can have all the military, capability that you want, but if the civilian leadership does not trust that the military leadership is not corrupt and is not fielding weapons that are not as capable as they say they are.
Which was the rocket force issue, right?
May have been one of the rocket force issues, right? That they were taking money for systems that weren't performing the way they were supposed to perform. All of those things could really throw cold water on maybe a more strident policy that would lead to conflict in a place like the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, where The military is like, hey, boss, we can do it. And the boss is like, yeah, I don't know. I just fired 5 of you guys. And I'm not entirely sure that, I trust your opinion on that.
So how do these firings, disappearances, erasers, purges, how does this impact PLA morale?
Well, that cuts both ways. On the one hand, you could believe that, yeah, it's like, hey, the generals are getting fired and new generals, maybe not from our own service, are getting put in charge of our organization, and that could have a negative impact on morale. I have heard anecdotally from some of my colleagues that have served in China more recently that the lower you go down in the ranks, they actually sort of appreciate the anti-corruption campaign and getting rid of the graft and getting rid of because remember, junior people used to have to pay for promotions.
Yeah.
And so if your career track was like, how much money have you saved up and how much can you afford to pay the 3-star or the 4-star general?
Which doesn't necessarily guarantee competence.
Which doesn't guarantee competence. So you're seeing a lot of incompetent people being able to pay their way to the top. You're working really hard, but maybe you don't have the family resources
and wealth,
and wealth that you might need to get promoted. Well, you want to see those people go away. And so at some level, there is a positive impact. Xi Jinping is like, I need to get rid of corruption to actually get the loyalty of people, further down the chain of command who don't want to pay for promotions.
So is this pay-to-play system for promotions, is that still in practice? I mean, does that still occur and happen?
Officially, it does not.
Well, but official and real are two different things sometimes.
The corruption in the PLA has been so endemic that it's like a cancer. It's just really, really hard to get rid of. And at some point, without transparency and without the right amount of oversight, it is just difficult to keep it from cropping up again and again.
So is this part of the reason why we're seeing the PLA really move a lot more towards AI, intelligentization, software algorithms, and so forth for their command and control systems? Are they really trying to achieve the same efficiencies that the U.S. is pursuing? Or is this a way for them to circumvent the potential distrust that they may have, I'm not saying they do, but that they may have in their military officers to execute with competence?
I'm going to go with yes, but I want to caveat that by saying I think the primary reason that the PLA is pursuing AI and what they call intelligentization is they understand that warfare is starting to move at the speed of machines. And so they need to insert artificial intelligence and machine learning into their operations just to keep up with other modern militaries. However, in terms of what might be barriers to adopting AI that we experience here in the West because, what if the AI kills a bunch of school kids and, what if the AI takes over and
or has a hallucination.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
I think at some level you could argue that the Chinese government and the PLA trusts the machines more than the people, which is to say their experience has been that the machine will do what I tell it to do when I tell it to do it. But I'm not sure I can count on the people for the same thing, right? That the people continue to disappoint, but the machines so far have a pretty good track record. So in terms of – now, that's not – they are not ignorant to problems with hallucination or problems with –
But if they're more biased to trust the software, the algorithms, the AI and all of that.
I was told when I first got to Beijing – if I was sitting at a table alone with 12 Chinese officers, I did not need to worry about my counterpart not trusting me because there were 11 other people in the room that he mistrusted more than me. The PLA has some fundamental trust issues, especially now, I think, between the civilian component of the government and the military officers. So there is that. This problem with corruption and removing the officers and things could continue to be a drag on PLA operational effectiveness.
Well, for our listeners, y'all know that I have long been an advocate for human cognition in the forward edge of the battle space because I do think that the way that we train in the U.S. military, air, space, sea, undersea, the Marine Corps, land, and so forth, it doesn't matter where you are within the DoD, but I think that we seek to cultivate that trust among teammates. And I also believe that human cognition will continue to be able to operate, innovate, and be able to make decisions and act through uncertainty, through chaos, in a way that commanders can trust because we understand commanders' intent. And also, when you operate in realms that are outside of where the AI has trained, you might be faced with something where you get that blue screen of death for whatever that machine might be. So it's interesting you talk about they trust the machines more than the people. I think in the U.S. military, we probably trust the people more than the machines.
Well, if we want to keep talking about this, I think the U.S. has all of this operational experience, maybe not in large-scale conflict that we haven't seen since the Second World War. But your experience, my experience, our comrades' experience has been that war is unpredictable and that all kinds of things can go wrong. And you need that person in the cockpit. You need that person in the command center who can make the call and take responsibility for it and follow up on it. And that just hasn't been China's experience. They just don't have that kind of operational experience. So what Chinese leadership wants is predictability and repeatability. They want to be able to push the button and know exactly what's going to happen so they can calculate the outcome. And putting lots of humans with lots of decision-making power into that equation
creates a lot of uncertainty.
And
variance.
And variance. And they don't want uncertainty and variance. They want to know that they push the go button and the system will do exactly what it is supposed to do. And until they, are proven otherwise by their own experience, and again, they're not ignorant to, the U.S. experience, the Russian experience. I mean, it's like they look at what happened in Ukraine and we can go on and on about that. But that didn't work out the way anybody thought it would. And our invasion of Iraq in 2003, that didn't go exactly the way the Department of Defense wanted it to either. So they're not ignorant to these ideas. But at an operational level, I think they do want to know that the system is going to perform as advertised when they push the go button.
Which, to me, I think opens up a lot of interesting opportunities to hack, mistrain, provide bad data, and otherwise seek to corrupt their algorithms.
That will be our secret plan.
Dirty tricks. Yes, I love it.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From,
do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To,
he has your eyes.
He's perfect.
Learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
Okay, so we know that China is leaning forward. They're professionalizing their military. They're advancing their capabilities. And they just recently conducted what they called Strait Thunder 2025 Alpha near and around Taiwan, April 1st and 2nd. And it generated a lot of headlines. What was unique about this exercise? Because we have seen the PLA and the PLAAF and the PLAN do a lot of interesting things in the past couple of years, from flying with Russian bombers up through the Arctic Circle to circling and making blockades around, practice blockades around Taiwan, to live fire exercises, New Zealand, Australia. So what's different about Strait Thunder?
So it's a new name. As near as I can tell, that is
Give me more, man.
That is pretty much where we're at. It took place April 1st and 2nd, like you said, in the waters and airspace around Taiwan. We've got some data from the Taiwan Ministry of National Defense. Again, 48-hour exercise apparently involved 135 PLA aircraft, 38 PLA Navy vessels, and 12 official vessels. Again, there are my air quotes. That probably refers to Coast Guard cutters. So we saw two exercises that were pretty much the carbon copies of Strait Thunder 2025A. We had Joint Sword 2024A in May of last year, and Joint Sword 2024B in October. There was speculation there might have been a Joint Sword 2024C, but that was probably part of a different exercise, and the press got out ahead of its skis on labeling that. But Strait Thunder 2025A has been characterized as a routine large-scale training drill. And that's what China's Eastern Theater Command called it in Chinese. It was called a drill, not an exercise, right? So it wasn't the kind of thing where you had some kind of narrative like, okay, we're blockading the blue forces or the green forces, and we're doing this and we're doing that, and there are decisions that need to be made. It was just a bunch of events. Okay, so now you're going to do like some air-to-air engagement. And over here, you're going to do some live fire. And over here, you're going to,
So it wasn't really integrated in that broader scenario like what we seek to do when we do exercises.
Yeah, it appeared to be a series of drills versus a a more comprehensive or integrated exercise.
Yeah.
There's a great analysis in the Jamestown Foundation's China brief that appeared on April 11th that compares and contrasts the Straight Thunder 2025A
With joint
exercise
swords from last year.
with the joint swords and other similar exercise actually over the last few years. So the bottom line is it doesn't seem like there's much to see here. It's mostly for PR value. I do have a contact, fairly well placed, who told me that these exercises have sort of fallen into a routine, that Taiwan has been watching these and they're sort of like,
So are we becoming desensitized to their operation?
no, it's more that the PLA, I think, has
Getting
fallen
late.
into a routine.
Okay.
Like what my source was telling me was that they fly a few hours in the morning, day one. They'll fly for like 6 hours. Then they'll take a break, have a little nap. And then after dark, after sunset, they will fly for another 4 hours. And then the next day, they will do the same thing again. And they will fly for a few hours in the morning. And then they will take a break, take a little nap, have some lunch, and then fly after dark, right?
Well,
And
but
that's it.
are they getting better at what they're doing? I mean, if you're talking about drills, you're looking at tactics, techniques, and procedures. I mean, even if it might not be integrated into a broader scenario with other capabilities towards some sort of fabricated campaign objective, right? But are they getting better?
It's hard to tell because I think there are lots of militaries that could fly 135 sorties over the course of 48 hours. But that's way different than flying 135 sorties every single day for 2 weeks or for a month, right? Or flying 300 sorties a day. You can't just scale up. So they do these short little snapshot exercises, whether it's a joint sword or a straight thunder or any of the ones that came before it. And they're very short, right? They're just a day or two. They're probably being flown and using naval forces that are in place.
Okay.
Or in theater. So there's no like big logistics tail. There's no like you don't have to all your guys know it's coming, like, so they're turning wrenches and they're doing all the maintenance.
They're surging for 48 hours, but then they're like, whew, they're done.
Yeah. And so we have no idea, at least not from these exercises that are being publicized. We have no idea like what their sustainment plan, what their maintenance plan, what their pilot fatigue issues might
Can they
be.
feed the fight? Can they
Can they feed the
sustain
fight? Can they
combat
sustain?
operations for longer than 2 days? I mean,
Right. Show me a 3-week exercise where the PLA consciously takes pieces off the board. Oh, that command center, that sector operations center went down. Like now you have to flex command and control to another sector operations center. Now you've lost this many command and control aircraft. Now you've got maintenance problems. Now you've got fuel problems. Now you've got all these things.
so they don't stress the system because they're not actually doing exercises. They're doing drills.
What I've said before is that there are other exercises that are not as well publicized as these named exercises.
All right.
And from open sources, we just don't have a whole lot of insight into those exercises. But the media is looking for the shiny
The next big
object.
thing.
And the shiny object is the named 48-hour exercise where there's video and where Taiwan gets all animated and waves their hands and said, this is practice for a Taiwan invasion. And it's a named exercise and it's a bright, shiny object. But I don't know that it really tells us anything about combat capability.
But you mentioned that China is doing other exercises that are not nearly as well publicized.
Sure.
Are these filling that gap?
They might be. But again, I'm hard-pressed to tell you from open source. I mean, we could go on and on about this. Maybe we do another podcast on Chinese training. China's had a lot of training issues, not the least of which, I think you alluded to this before, is they're building this force up so fast, right? There was a great, I know, it's Aerospace podcast, right? But there was a great analysis from the China Maritime Studies Institute up at the Naval War College. Talked about Chinese Navy training centers. The bottom line is they're building so many ships so fast, and all those ships have to be crewed.
That you're putting inexperienced crews in the ships, and they're also putting inexperienced pilots in these aircraft.
Right. So they're putting inexperienced crews on the ships, and the training centers are complaining that they're just having to jam people through. Right? They have to jam these ships through, and they have to certify them. There are my air quotes again. They have to certify these ships as being operationally capable. And again, hey, I got a kid in a private school, right? Maybe you could help me out a little bit and I'll pass your ship on this test. And, again, it leads to corruption and people maybe taking bribes, but also just feeling the pressure from higher echelons, from higher headquarters, that if you do not push these people through the training pipeline and certify them, whether it's an aircraft or a ship or anything else, that is going to look bad on you. So until planes start falling out of the sky or aircraft start crashing on the flight decks of aircraft carriers, it's going to be pretty difficult for either us or the PLA to really know.
Assess their readiness.
How ready they are.
Their tactical credibility and operational credibility. Because that was the other thing I was going to ask, is that during World War II, when we experienced a similar surge in the pilot population, as many and actually a few more pilots died in pilot training than actually died in combat.
Yep.
And so you have to be able to scale and produce at a rate where you can accept the production losses so that you can then feed the fight towards combat and still be able to accept the attrition losses that you get in actual combat. So there's two ways you can go when you're doing these surge operations. Is either we're going to see it within losses during normal daily operations that aren't necessarily very stressed, or we see them scale back how they fly their aircraft to be much more safety conscious, less risk tolerant, and therefore less tactically credible.
Yeah.
So the INDOPACOM Commander Admiral Paparo was on Capitol Hill in April testifying before the Armed Services Committee, and he was speaking about some of these readiness issues, right? The PLA escalated military pressure against Taiwan by 300% in 2024. And that's a direct quote. Then that to me seems really significant. Was Straight Thunder exercise part of this ongoing pressure campaign, or is this again just for show? Is info operations?
Yeah, so that I think the increasing military pressure against Taiwan by 300%, I think that probably falls into the lies, damn lies, and statistics category. He's talking there, I think.
Like, how's he quantifying this?
Right. So if you go on with that quote a little bit, it says, through activities such as air defense identification zone entries and centerline crossings. So I'm not going to spend 5 minutes describing the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone. It's something that the U.S. set up in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. It is a huge airspace that actually extends over mainland China. And there is a corner of that airspace that is part of the ADIZ as recorded on the maps, but China has to cross that corner in order to go through the Luzon Strait and get out into the Philippine Sea. So every time they cross that corner, it's an ADIZ incursion. So
is this a change, or is this just normal operations? I mean, are we seeing it, what strikes me is escalation pressure. That shows me that it's an increase of these kinds of operations. So why the change of the status quo?
The increase in the status quo is, a lot of this is China needs more experience with overwater training, and they need more time in this airspace. Even the centerline crossing, where the centerline is not a formally agreed boundary. The centerline was actually, again, set up by the United States Air Force. Why? Because we didn't want Taiwan flying too close to mainland China. Taiwan's Air Force capabilities used to be far, far superior to those of the PLA. And Taiwan would fly right up to the coast. I mean, screw the 12-mile limit
the panda bear on the belly button,
or the 2-mile limit that preceded it. They would fly right up to the Chinese coast because Chinese air defenses and Chinese fighters were powerless against, the F-5s and the things that we were providing to the Taiwan Air Force. So the United States actually established the centerline and said, hey, Taiwan, you will not fly across the centerline. And then for years and years, decades, in fact, both sides sort of respected
set a precedent and codified this informal boundary.
And so now the PLA is like, oh, yeah, no, look at the air defenses. Look at the missiles. Look at the 4th gen, 5th gen aircraft. Like, screw the centerline. We're going to fly wherever international law allows, which has been the U.S. position. As long as they don't go within 12 miles of Taiwan, it's just international airspace. There's nothing in international law about a Taiwan centerline. It's just, again, custom. It was what was the status quo. But
because they're challenging the status quo, I would actually agree with Admiral Paparo. I mean,
Sure.
They are pushing up the pressure.
They are increasing the pressure, and Taiwan is very, very happy to point that out to the world, that there has been this change to the status quo. Some of the other things that Admiral Paparo talked about in his testimony, I'll just read a couple of quotes here. In 2024, the PLA demonstrated its growing capabilities through persistent multi-domain pressurization activities of increasing scope, scale, complexity, and number against Taiwan, combined with a significantly expanded daily air and maritime presence. So that, again, goes back to this is a change to the status quo. There is more daily activity. The numbers, the trend line is definitely going up. But I think it's important to underscore what he said here about this multifaceted approach. It's not just military, but it's also psychological operations, things that are being put out in media, it's cyber operations, it's economic coercion, right? There are lots of things at play there.
It's the whole dime.
It's the whole dime. And we'll talk about that here in a minute when we get to the talking about the Chinese national security paper. The other thing that I'll point out from Admiral Paparo's testimony is that he said China has provided 70% of the machine tools and 90% of the legacy chips, these computer chips, that have enabled Russia to rebuild its war machine. And then Russia is coming back to China potentially with things like submarine quieting technology, aircraft engine technology, and other areas where Russia is strong. So made very clear to the Senate and the House Armed Services Committee this connection between China and Russia.
Yeah, it's clear to me that we're looking at the rebuilding of an axis. You're really seeing Russia and China again, friends with no boundaries, and what you just spoke to indicates how they're strengthening their relationships. We've seen Chinese military members in Ukraine, in addition to North Korea, and then we've also seen industrial support to Iran as well. So from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran aligning their interests together, I think we're seeing, again, a new axis that the Western world is going to have to confront and contain.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm ready to go back to George Bush's axis of evil speech in his
I know it has such baggage, but
yeah. But it is accurate in that, like, the Japanese Empire and the Nazis were not aligned by any particular ideology, but they were aligned in terms of interests, right?
They don't have to see the world the same way, but they just have to see the opportunity to exploit seams, weaknesses, vulnerabilities for their own interests. So they might not be the best of friends, but they could very easily work together.
But it is very much about aligning interests.
Yeah. And even if they don't fully trust each other, if they still work together, that creates a challenge for us and our allies and partners. So we just talked about the strengthening relationship between and Russia. Tell us about the great pancake cook-off between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. What was that?
Okay, so this was a photo op. This happened on I believe it was May 8th. That was the day that they were commemorating the end of the Second World War in Europe, right? VE Day, we called it.
Yep.
And so Xi Jinping goes to Moscow, and when Vladimir Putin had come to Beijing, Xi Jinping and Putin, I guess, had made dumplings, traditional Chinese dumplings.
Okay.
So Putin has Xi in Moscow, and they make blini. And blini are like Russian crepes. Maybe they're made with potatoes, I think. I don't know. But they're these little thin Russian pancakes. And then after they cooked them side by side and made their blini, they went over to this buffet table, and apparently they had all these different types of caviar, and they put caviar on the blini, and they had those, and they washed them down with shots of vodka. So it was all very, very friendly. But I think the allies that cook together stay together. I mean, they're really trying to show the West how close these two leaders have become. And apparently there are some indications that Xi Jinping, on a personal level, really does like Vladimir Putin. So there's something. But let me just get to the joint statement, right? Because I think this is really where, like, this was the official declaration of what came out of that meeting. And it's interesting that the U.S. was called out specifically in this joint statement. But it says the two sides will further deepen military mutual trust and coordination, right? Mm-hmm. They will expand the scale and scope of joint military exercises. They will regularly organize joint maritime and air patrols. That gets to the thing
bombers in the Arctic.
Where we're talking about going to the bombers in the Arctic and things like that, and patrols in the Sea of Japan. And they will strengthen exchanges and cooperation in bilateral and multilateral frameworks and promote China-Russia military cooperation to a higher level. The interesting thing in the joint statement is that it goes on to call out the U.S. and its allies by name. And it says both sides, Russia and China, note that the United States and its allies are attempting to extend NATO eastward into the Asia-Pacific, forming exclusive small circles in the region. So what are these small circles? That would be like the Quad, bringing the British aircraft carrier deployment into the Pacific, the French, the Australians, and so on. So small circles courting local countries to implement their, quote, Indo-Pacific strategy, thereby undermining regional peace, stability, and prosperity. So again, calling these things out by name, a lot of heartache, both Russia and China realizing that the U.S. pursuing its what China calls the Cold War alliance structure and continuing to try to form alliances and these small circles, regional agreements. China's really seeing that as like a Pacific NATO, an attempt at a Pacific
to create a
NATO.
Pacific NATO.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's interesting that in that joint statement, enhancing and expanding joint exercises. And you've spoken about this before. Can you just remind our audience about the joint Russian and Chinese military exercises that they've done in the past?
We did see this China-Russia exercise in the Arctic last year, basically just showing basic flight proficiency, basic logistics, no air-to-air refueling for the Chinese aircraft, no real attempt at long-range targeting, it seemed. It was just to sort of prove that they could. So now that they have done that and they've broken the bubble on that, maybe we'll see some operational capabilities demonstrated in some of these joint exercises and joint patrols. That has yet to be seen.
Yeah, I think what's important there is that they are trying to exercise and operate near each other in coordination or deconfliction with each other, but that's a far cry from how we operate and exercise with our allies and partners, where we're integrated, we're embedded, and we're in some ways interchangeable. And I think that that's a really key distinction and difference between the two of them. So you just spoke about the joint statement that was released by Xi and Putin. And recently then China also published its first white paper on national security. Is this like our NDS, the National Defense Strategy? Give us highlights on what the paper means and what it says.
Yeah, so first of all about the Chinese white paper. So we used to enjoy Chinese white paper on defense about every 2 years. They were coming in as on like clockwork, and we would talk about them within the China Watcher community. The 2010 white paper versus the 2012 white paper, and so on and so forth. That has slowed down a lot.
Why?
I think a lot of this is the PLA coming into its own and just feeling more stronger and more confident, and they don't necessarily need to justify to the world or explain to the world what it is that they're doing in a publicly released white paper. In 2015, we saw a white paper that they characterized as China's military strategy, and that was very informative, but that's about 10 years ago now. Then in 2019, there was a defense white paper, and that was sort of the last defense white paper that we've seen. Now there is this white paper that was released without any advance notice on May 12th, translated into English. It's about 35 pages long. And it is about national security, big N, big S. So it's not really like a national defense strategy, which is what the previous white papers were. It's really more like a national security strategy, right? National security strategy put out by the White House, very high level, talks about all aspects of national security with still a heavy emphasis on defense and military objectives. The interesting thing about the Chinese national security strategy, or national security white paper, I should say, is this national security concept that lies in the, quote, overall. They say the overall is the soul of China's national security in the new era. So what does that mean? It really focuses on what the Chinese call comprehensive national power, or CNP. It's a strategic framework used by China to assess their overall strength and influence. and it encompasses like everything: political power, economic power, military power, scientific and technical power, cultural influence, diplomatic influence, and human capital. So it is just much more comprehensive in terms of their approach to national security is just so much more comprehensive than military power. Mm-hmm. So it's an assessment tool, but it can also be a planning tool. There are actually some things that have been written about how, like from academic institutions and things, about how to actually calculate comprehensive national power for China. And again, it goes way beyond like how many missiles can you send downrange and put on a target and whatever. It's about what is the formula for how strong you are with your military in conjunction with how strong you are economically, how strong you are diplomatically, how strong you are in terms of human capital and natural resources and so on and so forth.
Cultural influence. No, that's really interesting. So what does this mean for us?
Well, if we're keeping the focus on the military and the PLA, there's only one paragraph in the whole national security white paper that talks about the military. And again, it's 35 pages long, translated into English. So this one short paragraph kind of leads you to believe that their focus on national security, very comprehensive, and the military is just one small part of it. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not, at least from the Chinese perspective, all military all the time. What they do say in that one paragraph is a bunch of stuff we've heard before. They want to improve leadership and management. That's probably a nod to some of the problems they've had with leadership that we've already talked about in this podcast. They want to deepen reform on the joint combat system, right? So more focus on jointness. But as part of this call to improve the military for national security, they talk about improving national defense science and technology industry. So as part of this effort to improve the military, in this one paragraph, they talk about optimizing the layout of the National Defense Science and Technology Industrial Base and improving what they call the Integrated National Strategic System and capabilities, which may refer to nuclear weapons. So science and technology for defense industry and improving their strategic systems in terms of nuclear weapons.
What's interesting about that is because so little of that white paper focuses on the military element and aspects of that, but they see that as a broader strategy, a security strategy for their ambitions. It's that we as a nation and our allies and partners can no longer ignore Chinese actions simply because they're not kinetic. Because they don't go boom doesn't mean that we can take it as friendly or can just tolerate that. We have to be conscientious of how those actions continue to advance China's ambitions to be a global power and hegemon.
Well, and they're also coming into their own in terms of justification for military action. If their approach to national security is this comprehensive, at what point does an economic issue suddenly become where they're going to pull the M and the military lever to address an economic issue? And you're like, hey, deal with economic issues with economics. And they're like, no, economics is a national security issue.
It's all integrated.
Natural resources are a national security issue. Food security is a national security issue. So at what point, when they do not get resolution through diplomatic means or economic means, do they pull the military lever, justifying that action by saying this is a part of China's national security?
Which makes sense in their active defense posture, right? That taking the first shot doesn't necessarily mean they're being offensive. It means that they're just simply protecting and being defensive.
Correct.
Which is not how the Western world sees things at all.
I have taught you well, Heather.
Oh, I thank you. Okay. So one thing that has happened recently that I think is really interesting is the use of a Chinese J-10C fighter by Pakistan in a recent conflict with India, right? So the type shot down at least 2 Indian fighters on May 7th, one of which was a French-made Rafale 4.5 Gen fighter. So what does this tell us about Chinese military technology compared to Western technology? I got my own thoughts, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, I think I'm probably going to say what you say, and that is it probably tells us absolutely nothing. But that has not prevented the media, the popular media especially, from running with this as, well, a J-10 shot down a French-made Rafale fighter.
Must be so much better.
It must be so much better because they have, the popular press has this idea that was advanced by Hollywood, which at one point was accurate, right? You had to see a fighter to engage it, and you got into these gnarly dogfights where they went to the merge and, one guy went high and the other guy went low and turning radius was an important thing. It's all about dogfighting and all that. And that's probably not what happened over the border between India and Pakistan in early May. So first and foremost is like, where are we getting the data? Where are we getting the information about this? And we're getting it from Pakistan and India. And those are not necessarily reliable sources. Pakistan claimed 5 downed Indian aircraft with no losses. At one point, other Pakistan sources claiming many, many more Indian aircraft were shot down. Maybe some of those were drones and they were counting those as aircraft. India sort of confirmed that something bad had happened with the Indian Air Force because initially they were like, they went quiet. They had no comment. They weren't commenting on the engagement and whatever happened that week. The only thing from a Reuters report, there were unnamed American officials quoted in a May 9th article that seemed to confirm that the Pakistani Air Force had at least shot down 2 Indian fighters, and one of them was in fact a French-made Rafale fighter, which is the 4.5 generation fighter that you mentioned. So both sides are posturing, and we have to be really suspect about what they said happened. Pakistan is obviously going to say it was a great victory for Pakistan. India is going to say, no, nothing to see here, nothing really happened.
So take it with a grain of salt, but what do you assess happened?
So a couple of things to put out there. J-10C, 4.5 generation fighter, started out as a 4th generation fighter, was sold to Pakistan with a Chinese air-to-air missile called the PL-15, basically the Chinese version of the AMRAAM.
Yeah.
It has a longer range, but what open sources say is that the version, the PL-15E, the version that was sold to Pakistan was caged to 145 kilometer range, about an 80 nautical mile range. Now, open sources also say the Rafale was sold to India by the French with the Meteor air-to-air missile, which has a longer stick, a 200 kilometer range, which works out to about 108 nautical miles. The Meteor is a beast, right? Solid-fueled ramjet engine, travels at like Mach 4. It has this wicked, like, no-escape range where, like, once it gets close to you, there's just
the turn and run,
You can't get away, right? Now, again, from the very, very limited reporting we have, there are no indications the Rafale was shot down with a Meteor missile still intact. They found the wreckage. There was a shorter-range IR missile found in the wreckage, but there was no indication that the Meteor was in there. Now, maybe the Rafale had a Meteor and it fired it. Maybe it wasn't carrying one at all. But I don't think this really tells us anything about like how good the J-10 is compared to the Rafale, how good the Chinese technology is compared to the Western technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing. It's the aircraft, it's the sensor suite, it's the weapon, it's how it's integrated with the broader military capabilities. So AWACS, the version of AWACS, do you have ground stations? Is there an integrated air defense? How you're all operating together, and then the training, right?
Right. And so this may tell a story when and if we do find out more about the details of the engagement. This may tell a story more about systems integration and how well Pakistan has done systems integration versus how well India has done systems integration. India has a much bigger military, a much bigger air force, but it's a hodgepodge of Western technology and Israeli technology and Russian technology and a lot of Indian-produced indigenous technology. And so systems integration on the Indian side of the border is a lot harder.
Lots of cats and dogs.
It's a lot of cats and dogs, right? So there was a report on 12 May, very recent, from China Space News, which is a Chinese defense industry magazine. Now, this is one report, but that China Space News article says that the Pakistan Air Force deployed a, quote, locked by A, launched by B, and guided by C combat system.
That sounds like an interesting kill web.
Right. So they integrated ground radars with fighter jets and airborne early warning aircraft. And according to this article, first, a ground system, maybe a surface-to-air missile system or some other type of radar system, illuminated the Indian target. Then the J-10 launched its missiles, probably at range. And finally, an airborne early warning and control aircraft used a mid-course data link to update and guide the missile to the Indian fighter, right? So again, long-range shot beyond visual range. We have no idea where the Rafale was. Was it like, had it conducted a bombing operation on the Pakistan side of the border, or it was like, heading away?
Yeah, there's no context to really be able to assess this. But I will say that shot by A,
locked by A,
launched by B, guided by C, that is probably the most interesting element of this, even though we lack the rest of the context.
Yeah. There's also been a suggestion on some of the message boards that perhaps, and again, it's just wild speculation, maybe there was a rules of engagement issue, which is to say that we are talking about two nuclear powers. They seem to have been sort of restraining themselves.
Did they have dissimilar rules of engagement? Was it
So imagine the Rafale was actually doing a bombing mission. And the Pakistan rules of engagement were, until you witness a hostile act, you can't do anything.
Yeah.
So the Rafale is doing an air-to-ground mission. It maybe doesn't have the escorts that it should. It maybe doesn't have the situational awareness that it should. But it's focused on its air-to-ground mission, and then as it turns to run, it is jumped by these Pakistani aircraft that have witnessed this hostile act and are now cleared to engage and just fire at range.
Well, and if they're firing at max range or something close to max range, does the Rafale even know or recognize that it has been targeted, that shots are in the air?
Exactly.
And frankly, also what axis the missile is coming from.
Yeah.
Because if radar energy is lighting you up from a different axis than where the missile is coming from, that can be a major challenge to be able to defend against.
100%. And there's some other news, and again, I'm not an expert on the Pakistan military, but they had apparently converted a number of Chinese aircraft that had previously been used for airborne early warning and control into electronic warfare aircraft. And that's a very recent shift. So we also don't know what the electromagnetic environment was. And again, what the Rafale could have seen, whether it was just getting a bunch of jamming energy as the PL-15, traveled down that jamming beam into the Rafale. We just don't have the details. But again, I go back to, what does this say about Chinese technology versus Western technology? Probably not a whole lot, but it probably says a lot more about systems of systems, about training, about tactics, right? About all of those sort of difficult to quantify things versus the size of the radar aperture, the speed of the turn, what has traditionally been the way that we measure fighter v fighter, which just simply isn't relevant anymore. We need to look at how those campaigns integrate over the whole. And I'm glad you brought up the whole element of the electronic spectrum, because I think that is an underappreciated element of what we need to cultivate, mature, and accelerate to the battle space in order to be effective. Because if we're neglecting the EMSO, we are missing the boat there. And we gave up electronic warfare in the 1990s when we slashed the Air Force in half. We went, that's not something we need to do. We can rely on other services to do that for us. In future battle spaces, they might not be able to go where we need to go. And so we need to be able to bring that capability back. 100%.
So before we leave, we'd be remiss and incomplete if we did not talk about China space. So China had a goal last year to conduct 100 launches, but they fell well short, right? So in 2024, they only had 68. What was their goal for 2025, and how are they doing so far?
Okay, so just as a benchmark, they set, once again, 100 is an important number. It's a nice round number. They set a goal for 100 launches. As of May 13th, right before we are taping this, they have had only 25 launches. Now, this week, the week of May 12th, they are supposed to have a number of other launches. But I think we are coming up on halfway through the year in, July 1st, and they're going to be hard-pressed to get to 50. So they're a little behind the curve. They are still rolling out their two different mega constellations. We talked about this a little bit on the last podcast. This is the Chinese version of Starlink. They've got two constellations, the civilian-oriented Qianfan, which means 1,000 sails, and the government-oriented Guowang, which means national net. So that's all happening. Maybe they're going to catch up on launches because they're going to start doing all of these mega constellation launches like Starlink has done, and they'll get up to their 100 number. But the bigger issue with these mega constellation launches is apparently the Chinese are putting a lot of space junk out there. And I think everybody who's listening will understand that space junk is a problem and debris in orbit is a problem. These things are all zipping around at 25,000 miles an hour. Now, I know space is a big place, and one of our space fellows, Charles, has told me that this is like two ants, running around Rhode Island. and okay, so there are thousands of objects up in space, so it's thousands of objects, the size of ants running around Rhode Island, but they're all traveling at 25,000 miles an hour. So eventually, a couple of those ants are going to run into each other. The point, though, is
but closure rates matter, right? 25,000 miles an hour is really fast, but closure rates matter. I mean, like if they're moving in this similar orbit, it may or may not be the same, but debris is a problem, and so the debris that they're putting up there isn't simply because of the ASAT that they demonstrated several years back,
right? But
is a byproduct of their launches.
Well, yeah. So in August 2024, so what, about 6 or 8 months ago, the upper stage of a Long March 6A rocket broke up after launching the first set of these 1,000 sails mega constellation satellites, and that created an orbital debris cloud. And so people were like, wow, that was unfortunate, but this might be a concern. The significance was that they're putting these mega constellations in a higher orbit than Starlink. So the second stages, whether they break up or stay intact, are up in a higher orbit.
And they're going to decay over time, so they're going to basically run into Starlink's orbit?
Well, no, that's the problem. So Starlink is down at around 550 kilometers, 600 kilometers. The industry standard is if you're going to put a rocket body up there because, you can't get it to come back down, you should keep it under 600 kilometers. Because eventually that orbit will decay and it will fall into the Earth's atmosphere and burn up. The problem with the Chinese launches is they're putting these rocket bodies between 700 and 800 kilometers before they abandon them. And so they're ending up in that 700 to 800 kilometer band where theoretically they could stay for like 100 years. I mean, decades at least. But some projections have them staying up there for 100 years. So they're talking about launching two different constellations of 10 to 15,000 satellites each.
Well, but that doesn't mean 10 to 15,000 rockets.
It doesn't mean 10 to 15,000 rockets. It's a smaller number of rockets. But the point is that it's not going to bother the Chinese mega constellations to have these rocket bodies floating around in that band because they're putting it up higher. But it becomes one of these things that it's the Wild West. There's no regulation. The Chinese companies are under tremendous pressure to deliver these capabilities and get these satellites up in orbit and increase the number of satellites on orbit. And they just don't seem to care about the future consequences.
Yeah. I don't know that regulation would matter to the Chinese. If they cared, then they would respect current norms.
Yeah, and that's just...
I mean, what you're going to do about it.
Yeah, what you're going to do about it. And so there's lots of talk about trying to take care of the space debris problem we have, that maybe there are things that can be done with grappling satellites or something that'll latch on and just burn it back down into orbit, into the atmosphere. But until something like that happens, maybe we should not be creating more space debris that will, hazard the satellites of other spacefaring nations. So.
Yeah, especially if you need to transverse that orbital regime to get to geosynchronous or cislunar or to the moon.
Yeah, we're just making it harder. And I think at this point, we don't need to make space harder. It's already pretty hard.
I don't think China cares.
Yeah.
JDAM, thank you. As always, great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Heather. I really enjoyed it. Let's do it again soon.
Sounds good. With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time.
Straight Thunder.
I love it. It's we were talking about the missing Chinese generals. All I could think about is that the closing scene of one of the closing scenes of Hunt for Red October.
Oh yeah.
They go, Vladamir, you've lost another submarine. Xi, you've lost another Chinese general. Yeah.